Welcome, Left Reckoning patrons. I'm Matt Leck. With me is David Griscom. David, hello.
What's up, brother?
Not a whole lot. We are returning on our Marx reading series. I meant to do the math of what today's date is in that sort of revolutionary calendar in France, but we're doing Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. That is it's a very interesting text. We'll have a sort of a clip to contextualize it with regards to the Communist Manifesto, but just some little calendar info. That is the 2nd of December. That is the 18th of Brumaire, and they put in a new calendar under Napoleon to break with the past. We forget that now, but or it's forgotten now. But yeah, that's where it lives on through Marx, basically exclusively. I don't hear a lot of reference to that besides that. There's some other historical. Why that date is significant. The 2nd of December, the 18th of Brumaire, that is the date that Napoleon crowned himself emperor in 1804, and then a year later, on the same day, defeated the for the Holy Roman Empire ended it as a result of the Napoleon winning at Austerlitz, is my understanding. And just a note for folks, this text is relevant for two reasons. One is this sort of historical info, which nerds like David and I do enjoy up to an extent, but also this is interesting for the application of sort of class and materialist theory to history and politics. Politics as it's actively going on. As we said, like Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto at the start of the sort of 1848 to 1851 revolutionary period. And this is sort of a sort of reflection on that. And to make that point even clearer, Vijay Prasad, and I'll link this in the show notes, but Vijay Prasad had a talk with Aijaz Ahmad on this, and Ahmad puts it this way.
In my view, there is a very interesting relation between the Communist Manifesto and the 18th Brumaire. 18th Brumaire is more or less a sort of counterpoint to the Great Manifesto. Manifesto comes in expectation of the revolution. And indeed, the revolution of 1848 breaks out within weeks of in fact, the publication of the manifesto, in fact, more or less coincides with the outbreak of the Paris Revolution, which then extends to large parts of Europe, particularly Germany, but also very large parts of Europe. This text comes as a way of looking back from the beginning of the revolution to the completion of the counter-revolution.
And we'll stop it there. The counter-revolution being Louis Napoleon, the original's nephew, basically a coup, crowning himself emperor again after he had already served a term as he was voted into office as president. And so, yeah, go ahead, David.
No, I'm saying, and like voted into office was like, somewhat close to like universal suffrage, right? Like the history here. I mean, like this is a tough text for a lot of reasons, and I think one of the reasons it is tough, and I'm not the only one who says this, is that it is very much about like recent events in France that there's sort of an understanding that the reader is like very familiar with. So it's one of those things that like reading in 2023 can be a little bit difficult just because, he's referencing all these different events and figures who you may have like a general understanding of or not know who they are at all. But like, yeah, effectively, like what this text is about this thing that opened up and looked like the beginnings of some kind of like new revolution, new movement that then slid into counter revolution. And like, I think like another aspect that's really interesting about this text in comparison to a lot of Marx's other texts is that like this is one of the more explicit times that Marx like deals with the state and what the state is, the different class politics, and like how they're sort of playing out on the national scene. Obviously, Marx wrote a lot about politics in his time, but he wasn't ever able to get to like the state in the same way that he was able to get to capital. And like there's all this talk that Marx's intention was to write Capital and then to write the state, right? There was supposed to be a Marxist take on this that was official. Obviously, Capital isn't even finished in its lifetime. The state isn't completed either. And the state becomes a question that a lot of Marxists spend a lot of time over the next 100 years sort of looking at. Obviously people like Rosa, people like Lenin, Polancis, people more contemporarily like Leo Panitch, right? Like this question of the state starts to become like a very important question of Marxism, because in the theory of Marxism as sort of laid out by Marx, it's not as developed as like theories of exploitation under capitalism. So 18th Brumaire, I think like beyond it's like how interesting it is, and it's like a really fun like the thing about it is like whenever I say that it's difficult, right? I don't want to dissuade people from reading it because while it's difficult because you're having to keep some history in your head, like the the text is incredibly flowery and fun and punchy, and it really is a masterful um, essay.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to say on that note, like this is what got me into Marx because of, like Marx is challenging in different ways in different texts. Like
Mhm.
Capital especially the opening of Capital is challenging for an entirely different type of way it makes your brain work.
Yeah.
And this one is more, which is more foreign to me, the economic sort of theoretical. This is more like political and historical, but that's like, more my speed. And so that's
Hmm.
why, and I think people who are into say like political YouTube and that sort of stuff and say following this sort of stuff, I think one, this is maybe more your speed as well, but also I think thinking it through this way of like the theory of class struggle is important if you are going to pay attention to the sort of like what's going on with the state and different sort of factions throughout, like say a coronavirus pandemic or something like that.
Yeah, no, totally. And yeah, I mean, like the only thing just to finish the thought there, um, is that like this text becomes like a touchstone for a lot of people later, to sort of try to tease out like Marx's theory of like historical materialism and his theory of the state and its relationship with capital and class. So, I mean, a really critical text, and like stoked to be doing it. This is probably one of the more intimidating ones I feel like we've done. We've done like Rosa was long, but Rosa, I don't know. This one, I've been nervous about recording this, so I'm like very excited to get into it with everyone.
Yeah. Well, we'll start with the people over at Socialism for All have a good audiobook reading with an occasional aside commentary, as such as like at the part at the end of this first section here when Marx says every sort of reform effort gets denounced as socialism. The author cuts in there. You want to say something there?
Well, I mean, actually, like, so we're gonna go over this more explicitly as we go on. But like, all right, for like the
Mhm.
most general audience, like, if you're
Yeah.
unfamiliar with this like history at all, like, like I'm gonna do this like as broad based as possible. Is
Right.
effectively you have like this early revolution that sort of pushes out the monarchy, this provisional government that like seems to be very progressive. A lot of conflict within that. Napoleon's nephew is able to win power during that period, and like Marx talks about him, in a very insulting way because the guy was a real doofus.
Hmm.
Was not some kind of like leader of any kind of revolutionary progressive cause, but much more of a backslide into reaction. But he wins this with, by winning popular elections. And then, as his sort of term in power is sort of coming to its end, instead of some kind of transfer back to maybe a representative more of like the liberal intelligentsia class or something like that, they just do a coup and he becomes emperor, right?
Yeah.
So these
Kind
are
of.
the three. I know this is like a very quick version of it, but like this is what the reaction is too. It's like this opening that seems like it's revolutionary, political crisis as that's going on. The buffoon basically becomes in charge of the state, and then the reforms and the victories, the democratic reforms, start to evaporate very, very quickly, and the return to an empire in France.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So like when Marx at the very beginning of this, there's the tragedy and farce line. The tragedy is the Napoleon original case, and the farce is his nephew coming around and farting around and still, and like the Napoleon original thing. And this is a point Matt Christman makes in Age of Napoleon, but like he's supposed to symbolize meritocracy, right? Like if it's not God who is ordaining our rulers who get to determine all this stuff, then it has to be some sort of merit. And instead, like the farce is like nobody thinks that about his nephew.
Mm-hmm.
It's so yeah, we'll start in here with this piece here, folks. We're not going to do each of these chapters word for word here, but we will do this opening one here, and we'll start this off with the reading by the folks at Socialism for All.
All right, so let's begin chapter 1, February 1848 to December 1851. Hegel remarks somewhere that all great world historic facts and personages appear, so to speak, twice. He forgot to add the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. Caussadière for Danton, Louis Blanc for Robespierre, the Montaigne of 1848 to 1851 for the Montaigne of 1793 to 1795, the nephew for the uncle.
And again, like those figures are just figures from the original French Revolution and the mid-19th century period we're talking about now.
And the same caricature occurs in the circumstances of the second edition of the 18th Brumaire. Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past.
Now, this is the Marxist.org translation of this. The run that I'm familiar with is the one that I think you've mentioned, David. The men make their own history, but they don't make it out of whole cloth. Is that metaphor just taken out, or does that appear later in the book?
I'd have to see. I was reading, so we were reading the same one. I'd have to check my Marx and Engels reader to see.
I hope that's still in there somewhere, because I do like the whole cloth thing. Like you're making it with like patches that you have left over instead of like fresh from the factory.
Yeah.
The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living, and just as they seem to be occupied with revolutionizing themselves and things, creating something that did not exist before, precisely in such epochs of revolutionary crisis, they anxiously conjure up the spirits of the past to their service, borrowing from them names, battle slogans, and costumes, in order to present this new scene in world history in time-honored disguise and borrowed language. Thus Luther put on the mask of the Apostle Paul. The revolution of 1789 to 1814 draped itself alternately in the guise of the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, and the revolution of 1848 knew nothing better to do than to parody, now 1789, now the revolutionary tradition of 1793 to 95. In like manner, the beginner who has learned a new language always translates it back into his mother tongue, but he assimilates the spirit of the new language and expresses himself freely in it only when he moves in it without recalling the old and when he forgets his native tongue. When we
let's stop.
Oh yeah, no, sorry, I should just let you do that.
No, that's cool.
I mean, this is a little bit that I think we can spend some time on, because like this is like you should read the whole text, but like this is the bit that gets cited, I think, the most from it, other than maybe sack of potatoes, which is going to come in a later chapter that we'll talk about in an upcoming episode. But this is a really, I think, critical line for understanding Marx's understanding of like history of economic conditions and things of that nature, because Marx oftentimes gets sort of labeled as a determinist, right? In the sense that like the economic conditions solely sort of determine what the course of action that is possible is. And this segment here, I think, really, this section here really highlights the contingency, to use another kind of fancy word, that like Marx believes exists in politics and in history here. So this like opening line, it's like men make their own history. So there's free will, right? Which is again something that like the Jordan Petersons, always people always accuse Marxism of denying people like their agency, right? Their ability to act. Marx is not denying that at all. He's saying they we act of our own volition, but we don't make it as we please. And what he's saying there is that like you have this action, this ability to act, this opening in politics that could go different ways, but it's constrained by the conditions of the time, um, and oftentimes things that have been inherited from even before your time, right? You basically like you are free to act, but you don't create the conditions around you, right? Which I think is a really important way to think about Marxism as a philosophy. Maybe it's predictive powers, and then I think more importantly for socialists and people who want to build a social society, how we interact with the world around us, because you get all of these. I mean, you see this a lot on like the contemporary left, like a lot of times people talk about revolution and changes in like the economic conditions in like an abstract way versus like a material way, in the sense of like, are you analyzing like the actual conditions? Like, okay, so how is the working class in America constituted right now? Where are their struggles? What's their level of organization? What are the political avenues that are open to them? All these other factors that go into it. A lot of times it's this kind of like moralistic. It's like, well, if everybody wakes up and they like start fighting, then like things are going to change. Like, well, that's not a particularly like Marxist view of history, or of like or a good way to even look at contemporary society. So
Mhm.
it's recognizing that like just because the conditions are sort of pointing in one way does not mean that things are predetermined, good or bad, when it comes to action. But Lord, you can't ignore this aspect and the way that it plays a major role in defining the possibilities and the opportunities that are available to different movements at their time, right? And, like, this is like, I think, as great um as like clear as you're going to get from Marx, honestly, and sort of laying out this theory of history. I particularly also love the line, "The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living." And like you can see if you have been following along with our reading series here too, you can maybe sort of remember some of his fights with like the young Hegelians as well. Um, in the way that like some of this is sort of laid out, in the sense that like no, these like ideas, they do play a role, right? These inherited aspects and understandings of yourself play a role in the way that people interact with the world, and you're not just going to be able to beat them with like an argument, right?
Mhm.
Through like pure force of like intellectual energy, right? Like these things are going to be reflective of certain social and economic conditions in society.
Yeah, and I like how he ends this paragraph on the talking about like the translation from a language. Like, are you actually, there's an action that speech is supposed to get at. So like, do you just sort of costume yourself? I mean, it reminds me of like the way people sort of invoke Fred Hampton as like,
Mhm.
oh, you should just be talking to white supremacists. It's like that. This seems like something's being lost in translation here,
Well, yeah,
as opposed to
100%.
right, like as opposed to like you actually walking the walk, and that leading to the sort of verbalizations coming out of you naturally.
Yeah, and like I think like this really, and we're gonna get more into this as we go on, because like this is like the crux of the piece, frankly. Um, but like the language he uses there about these old like kind of costumes or time honored traditions, or things that are familiar to us. I mean, you see that in politics all the time. Um, today, from things on the left, that it certainly plays a role, and you also see them on the right. Alex Jones, 1776, will commence again, and as like Marx will develop later, um, like the one, like a lot of the universalist language that you got out of like the bourgeois revolutions, like the French, the first French Revolution, the American Revolution, the English Revolution. Um, a lot of that was actually like a product to be consumed by like the bourgeoisie, the rising class at that time, to like universalize and make palatable the fact that they were running a class revolution, right? And like what they were trying to win, like America's a great example of this, right? All
Yep.
men are created equal, and then everyone knows the contradiction. There's like, well, how do you have people enslaved? It's like, well, the universal aspects to it were a way, in a lot of ways, of making the fact that what they were doing was running a revolution that was progressive. Let's like not be silly about this. That was certainly progressive to like the backwards British system that they were under, but it was a class revolution. It was a revolution of a mobilized merchant wealthy class in America trying to protect their rights to property, to landholder democracy, over a more backward system like of British colonialism in the Americas, certainly. But the universal language is just like a way to make it palatable. And what ends up happening is like you start to misremember these products, these intellectual products that are constructed at this time. And that's why this is like the first tragedy then is farce language is so apt, right? It's because like, if at first, there's some kind of tragic elements to it, later it almost becomes silly to listen in the way like the American Revolution is brought up by like the right and ruling class today.
Yeah, and it's so it is almost like, yeah, you just can't keep doing bourgeois revolutions, right? Like, and this next chapter here, this next chapter is like, this next paragraph, I should say, I keep saying that. The next paragraph is talking about how the original Napoleonic one was, it actually had some impact, but you just can't keep running that back and expecting it not to run into the bourgeois just continuing to consolidate as they did in, the 18th Brumaire.
Yeah.
About this conjuring up of the dead of world history, a salient difference reveals itself. Camille Desmoulins, Danton, Robespierre, Saint-Just, Napoleon, the heroes as well as the parties and the masses of the old French Revolution,
the original,
performed the task of their time, that of unchaining and establishing modern bourgeois society, in Roman costumes and with Roman phrases. The first one destroyed the feudal foundation and cut off the feudal heads that had grown upon it. The other created inside France the only conditions under which free competition could be developed, parceled out land properly used, and the unfettered productive power of the nation employed. And beyond the French borders, it swept away feudal institutions everywhere to provide, as far as necessary, bourgeois society in France with an appropriate up-to-date environment on the European continent. Once the new social formation was established, the antediluvian colossi disappeared, and with them also the resurrected Romanism. The Brutuses, the Gracchi, the Publicolas, the tribunes, the senators, and Caesar himself. Bourgeois society, in its sober reality, bred its own true interpreters and spokesmen in the Says, Cousins, Royer-Collards, and Guizot's. Its real military leaders sat behind the office desk, and the hog-headed Louis XVIII was its political chief. Entirely absorbed in the production of wealth and in peaceful competitive struggle, it no longer remembered that the ghosts of the Roman period had watched over its cradle.
And it's interesting there, I think when he talks about they eventually put aside their Caesar, what they're saying is they gave Napoleon the original, exit stage left. We're done with you now. We need to settle things down and get down to business again. And that it's so interesting, I think, to compare our own sort of mythologization of the American Revolution, right? Because it is like you say, like a mixed ground ideologically with regards to being progressive and also bourgeois.
Yeah.
Like it's easier to think of it in the sort of well, let me just play a little bit more because I want to bring in Danny Bessner's fascism thesis, because I think the way that people think they're fighting fascism, like once, like it does remind me of this sort of like historical dressing up.
Mm-hmm.
Though bourgeois society is, it nevertheless needed heroism, sacrifice, terror, civil war, and national wars to bring it into being. And in the austere classical traditions of the Roman Republic, the bourgeois gladiators found the ideals and the art forms, the self-deceptions, that they needed to conceal from themselves the bourgeois limited content of their struggles and to keep their passion on the high plane of great historic tragedy. Similarly, at another stage of development, a century earlier, Cromwell and the English people had borrowed from the Old Testament the speech, emotions, and illusions for their bourgeois revolution. When the real goal had been achieved and the bourgeois transformation of English society had been accomplished, Locke supplanted Habakkuk.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's very fascinating to me because just to go back to my English Civil War knowledge, John Milton, famous poet who wrote Paradise Lost, he was at that time the sort of continental translator slash assistant. So writing a lot of official correspondence to the continent. That Cromwellian bourgeois revolution eventually gets supplanted. We're going to bring the monarchy back, similar to the way that the French did. And he writes Paradise Lost, which is this sort of like reworking of the Bible and Genesis, and like that's just the language that they had now. So he's in a similar position that writing Paradise Lost that Marx is writing 18th Brumaire. Marx just goes with political philosophy and stuff like that instead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's the Marxist like analysis is like applicable to an American tradition, the French tradition, and English tradition here very well. And like that line, like the bourgeois, the self-deceptions that they needed to conceal from themselves, the bourgeois limited content of their struggle, and to keep their passion on the high plane of great historic tragedy. I mean, I think that like really, really highlights, the disconnect here, and why, again, this kind of return to like the great bourgeois revolutions of the past that you see, I mean, highlighted and acted out so well or not well, however you want to look at it, in the 18th Brumaire. It's comical, but you also see like the why this tendency is so hard to sort of put down in politics, because like this language is so critical, this understanding of themselves is so critical, this purposeful self-deception is so crucial and like baked into all of these societies, that like you need something new. And like as Marx is basically getting at, it's like the idea that like we're just going to be able to do bourgeois revolution internally forever is wrong. Like you need to have the new actor, the class that understands itself, the class that it's able to sort of break down these failings, because like at the end of the day, like while like members of the bourgeoisie can talk about liberty and fraternity and egalitarianism, equality, etc. They want, at the end of the day, their class interest is for class rule, which is which blocks out the possibility of those things actually existing, which is why the tragic nature of what happens with Napoleon III is so devastating, because there are these kind of calls and this idea that society is ready for another modernization, another influx of a new kind of politics and a new way of doing things, but because of the proletariat sort of not being in the position to be able to rule and to run this revolution, you just get a cheap remake of what had happened in the past. And like this also gets at some of the questions of a type of reformism as well, right? Where it's like the fundamental contradictions of like French society at the time, of American society, hell, American society after like our great second revolution, right, the Civil War. What happens after that? You have this brutal conflict. A lot of language about freedom and equality and liberty is brought up again. But because after the war is over, the ruling classes don't really want to start dealing with the property question, don't really want to start dealing with the redistribution question. You basically go through a period of revival for like a lot of those Southern planter interests, or at least Southern elite interests in the South, acquiescence from the Northern Republicans, and you see what the results of that have been when it comes to like equality and like a real fundamental. I mean, I don't want to downplay, obviously, like the end of slavery is a massive achievement in politics,
right.
in American history, but the point is that like there is like there's a limit to how far bourgeois revolutions are ever going to be able to go, and you see them just sort of constantly like ramming their head against the wall, historically, with this kind of contradiction, because it's fundamental to this society, be it the French or the American or the British one.
Exactly, and that limited very real desires at the time of these for sort of a type of freedom that, certain people thought we'd be get this through wage work or whatever, but like there was other types of yeah, I mean the 40 acres and a mule,
Hmm.
putting that behind, or like the more extreme reconstruction measures that could have been taken, and why didn't that happen? Isn't just a moral failing
Yeah.
on America's
No,
part.
I mean, like you couldn't. I mean, you really like, yeah. I mean, without. I mean, we had Matt Stanley on the program recently. People should listen to that interview where it's just like we talk about like the radical achievements of Reconstruction and also why they were ultimately unsuccessful at like transforming American society.
Yeah.
Um, in the way that we would, have wanted to see. And like basically what you would have had to have had was, a stronger representation of like working class politics, because from like the Northern Republican elites, to even members of like the early, Black political class, there were class divisions within those groups as well that sort of prevented the mass land redistribution that was going to be needed, to deal with the dispossession and the brutality of like American slavery, and being able to bring everyone up to being a full and equal citizen in this society, right? So um, yeah, I mean, it's like this is like one of the great tragedies, honestly, of a lot of like Western society, in like the 19th century, 20th century, is that like, without this kind of agent that understands itself as a class, we're talking about working people, working class, you basically have these massive upswells of like potential and social unrest and revolutions and changes in government and all this kind of things, but it just ends up returning to the same kind of class rule, class dictatorship that we're all sort of still under today.
Yeah. Um, yeah, we'll continue here.
Thus, the awakening of the dead in those revolutions served the purpose of glorifying the new struggles, not of parodying the old, of magnifying the given task in the imagination, not recoiling from its solution in reality,
Mm.
of finding once more the spirit of revolution.
Like I hate to keep taking shots about the fascism thing, but this is where I do entirely agree with Danny, because like I'm open to a certain type of understanding of fascism that's broad, but the way it's elaborated, particularly by like a bourgeois that thinks themselves as universal, is
Mm.
like Trump is attacking us. You got to vote for Democrats so we can do the Supreme Court. And it's like
Yeah.
I agree that's all important, but like but that is coming from a very specific sort of prescription coming from a bourgeois person. That's like, how do you fight fascism? That's just not. It's not
Yeah,
real.
you
It's
fight
not
fascism by voting for like, yeah, one part of the ruling class, right? That's
exactly.
like
Yeah.
less amenable to like certain perversions from, um, you know, if you want to call them lumpen or petty bourgeoisie in this country, right? You're like, no, totally, right.
Yeah.
I think that's a good point. Yes, like the specters of the past are sort of brought up to make, and like again, like Marx is saying, like in the original act, like there was a lot of validity, or at least political utility in utilizing like in Cromwell's case, like the Bible, um in
Mhm.
the French Revolution's case, looking at Rome, there was some validity in sort of utilizing that to like act upon this new tapestry, like act upon this new opening in history. But as time goes on, it just is not up to the task of sort of analyzing the world around you. Yeah, and like fascism and like the fight in World War II with the Nazis, obviously and rightfully, in my opinion, like holds a pretty strong imagination in America, like one of the better conflicts that we have been involved in,
Awesome.
right?
Yeah.
Where you can make the case about, a good side versus a bad side. And so like it's a very, very mobilizing and motivating thing. But again, like, like what like in the American case, like what's going on there? I mean, there's a full war mobilization of the United States, generations of people dedicating their time into the fight of like global fascism at that time. And then today they bring up the specter of the Nazi party and Nazism, but effectively just sort of corral and beat people into submission to like
Yeah.
the Democratic Party, right? It is pretty farcical when you put it like that.
It's wild, and it is like, it's wild how some of the shit doesn't seem to change,
Yeah.
But anyway, we'll continue here.
Making its ghost walk again. From 1848 to 1851, only the ghost of the old revolution circulated. From Marast, the Republican in yellow gloves, who disguised himself as Old Bailly, down to the adventurer who hides his trivial and repulsive features behind the iron death mask of Napoleon. A whole nation which thought it had acquired an accelerated power of motion by means of a revolution suddenly finds itself set back into a defunct epoch, and to remove any doubt about the relapse, the old dates arise again, the old chronology, the old names, the old edicts which had long since become a subject of antiquarian scholarship, and the old minions of the law who had seemed long dead. The nation feels like the mad Englishman in Bedlam, a famous English asylum, who thinks that he is living in the time of the old pharaohs, and daily bewails the hard labor he must perform in the Ethiopian gold mines. Immured in this subterranean prison, a pale lamp fastened to his head, the overseer of the slaves behind him with a long whip, and at the exits a confused welter of barbarian war slaves who understand neither the forced laborers nor each other, since they speak no common language. And all this, sighs the mad Englishman, is expected of me, a freeborn Briton, in order to make gold for the pharaohs. In order to pay the debts of the Bonaparte family, sighs the French nation. The Englishman, so long as he was not in his right mind, could not get rid of his fixed idea of mining gold. The French, so long as they were engaged in revolution, could not get rid of the memory of Napoleon, as the election of December 10, 1848, when Louis Bonaparte was elected president of the French Republic by plebiscite, was proved. They longed to return from the perils of revolution to the fleshpots of Egypt, and December 2, 1851, the date of the coup d'etat by Louis Bonaparte, was the answer. Now they have not only a caricature of the old Napoleon, but the old Napoleon himself, caricatured as he would have to be in the middle of the 19th century.
And we can kind of just say, like, that's them showing the limited imaginations, or the, I guess, historically determined to an extent imaginations of folks. And again, like the December 10th, when Louis Bonaparte was elected president of French Republic by plebiscite. Very disappointing for communists, right? Go ahead.
No, I mean, I just like, again, like we have to jump in and out of like this particular to like maybe more universal analysis, but like, yeah, like this is like, this whole experience is a bit of a counterpoint, as, we were highlighting, at the beginning of this, investigation, like to like maybe some of like the, you could call them Marxist or like communist theory of like progressive changes in society, right? Is that like we're going to extend the vote, we're going to extend political participation, and we're going to get like a new society. And here you like see this mass mobilization of people in 48. You see this extension of voting, and then what ends up returning is like an even more backwards, and it's a counter revolution, right? It's the easiest way to put it, right? Like this is a challenge though, right? For people who make the argument that like what we need to do is to like expand access to politics, bring more working class people into power. And obviously like let's not overstate like the levels here. What we're talking about, we're not talking about some kind of like pure true democracy that was existing at this time, but this is like, for a lot of people who are watching it felt like something was opening it up. It felt like the political opportunities, we're going to be progressive and we're endless, and instead it's stepping back to the great Napoleon, himself, right, as like a caricature, right? So the reason Marx is having to respond to this is like this felt like a major setback for the political ideas and mobilization of working peoples, in France, but also I think across Europe at that time as well. Like this 48 and some of the other movements that are happening at the time, people were like, this is the beginning of, this new epoch in political history.
Yeah, and the takeaway isn't that like universal suffrage is bad, it's that it's
Totally.
not sufficient, right? It's that there needs to be an underlying political organization. And he's going to get into, we talk about the proletariat, we talk about peasants,
Yeah.
lumpenproletariat, and why that sort of organization wasn't there.
Yes. So exactly. What happens next is basically Marx saying like, well, this is why it didn't happen. And this is why
Right.
what happened.
The social revolution of the 19th century cannot take its poetry from the past, but only from the future. It cannot begin with itself before it has stripped away all superstition about the past. The former revolutions required recollections of past world history in order to smother their own content. The revolution of the 19th century must let the dead bury their dead in order to arrive at its own content. There the phrase went beyond the content. Here the content goes beyond the phrase. The February Revolution was a surprise attack, a seizing of the old society unaware, and the people proclaimed this unexpected stroke a deed of world importance, ushering in a new epoch. On December 2,
the original February Revolution here is the ousting of Louis Philippe, the king prior to that, because of the unrest regards agricultural struggles and stuff like that.
Card sharp's trick, and what seems overthrown is no longer the monarchy, but the liberal concessions that had been wrung from it through centuries of struggle. Instead of society having conquered a new continent for itself, it seems that the state has only returned to its oldest form, to a shamelessly simple rule by the sword and the monk's cowl. This is the answer to the coup de main, unexpected stroke of February 1848, given by the coup de tête, rash act of December 1851. Easy come, easy go. Meanwhile, the interval did not pass unused. During 1848 to 51, French society, by an abbreviated revolutionary method, caught up with the studies and experiences which in a regular, so to speak, textbook course of development would have preceded the February Revolution, if the latter were to be more than a mere ruffling of the surface. Society seems now to have retreated to behind its starting point. In truth, it has first to create for itself the revolutionary point of departure, the situation, the relations, the conditions under which alone modern revolution becomes serious. Bourgeois revolutions, like those...
Let's hold it here for a second, because this next paragraph, I think, is one of the big ones.
Right.
But like, this is one of those things too, where it's like, so he's talking about like these movements in society, and it's like a sneak attack on the old powers, right? The old established powers weren't ready for this rupture that was about to come. But as we see and we'll get into later, like, you have this rupture, and then it like returns not only to like the previous state of affairs, but in fact going backwards. And like this again, like this gets to, I think, one of the most important points of like Marx, but also an important point of Lenin's. The Marx line here is like, men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. Which is like, these things are going to happen. There's going to be openings in society for change. But the idea that just in and of themselves, working people are going to be prepared, right? The working class, right? We're talking about one class here, right? We're Marxists. The working class being the class that has the potential of being the agent of history, because it's one of the few classes that has the potential of understanding itself as a class and understanding that its interests are diametrically opposed to the current conditions. And certainly also the conditions of the past, right? Like the thing about the proletariat is like a class of the future, unlike most of these other ruling and powerful classes in society. So like, this is why, and like, this is an event that happens later, obviously, but like, the famous story about Lenin dancing in the snow, when the Bolshevik Revolution had lasted longer than the Paris Commune, right? And again, Paris Commune is much later, but Lenin had this understanding from, seeing what had happened in other kind of moments where, like, there is, what's the word for it? Spontaneity, right? That people love to like sort of fetishize, I find, on the left. it runs up against the actual conditions. It runs up against the organized ruling class. And look, the difference between the ruling class and the working class is because the way that modern society, both today and certainly also in the case of France at this time, even though it's less developed than it is today, only needs a certain level of organization to be able to successfully, like, strangle any kind of working class um, movement. So, like, this is one of the things that I find that's a really important point of Marx and then of Lenin and thinkers later, is that unlike maybe a more like anarchist or even just sort of like, let's use the word like pop socialist, like pop leftist. And what I mean by that is just sort of like, it's not really like laid out in like theory. It's not really laid out by anything. It's just sort of things that have sort of absorbed and hang around, just like we have like pop science, right? Sort of like, understandings of the world, and like sometimes they're reflective in some ways, but oftentimes they're missing very, very crucial understandings of, in the science case of, science, in the political sense of, the actual conditions that have led to successful revolutions, or the conditions that led to unsuccessful revolutions in the past, right? Which is why so much of like modern American left discourse is all about will and like feeling and energy, instead of like looking at class structure and organization. So this is something that like Lenin really starts to develop later. It's like, how do we organize a class so that when you do see these kind of ruptures, when you do see these moments where the old order is unaware, right, or unprepared, that we have the capacity to take advantage of that moment and win. And like, this is an example of what happens when it's not there.
Right. And so this section starts: bourgeois revolutions like those of the 18th century storm more swiftly from success to success.
Of the 18th century storm more swiftly from success to success. Their dramatic effects outdo each other. Men and things seem set in sparkling diamonds. Ecstasy is the order of the day, but they are short-lived. Soon they have reached their zenith, and a long Katzenjammer takes hold of society before it learns to assimilate the results of its storm and stress periods. So,
Katzenjammer is German for hangover.
On the other hand, proletarian revolutions, like those of the 19th century, constantly criticize themselves, constantly interrupt themselves in their own course, return to the apparently accomplished in order to begin anew. They deride with cruel thoroughness the half-measures, weaknesses, and paltriness of their first attempts, seem to throw down their opponents, only so the latter may draw new strength from the earth and rise before them again more gigantic than ever, recoil constantly from the indefinite colossalness of their own goals, until a situation is created which makes all turning back impossible, and the conditions themselves call out, "Here is the rose, here dance." For the rest, every fair observer, even if he had not...
I mean,
just one note on the "here's the rose, now dance." I've seen a different translation that's regarding the Aesop's fable thing about the island of Rhodes, like "you're in Rhodes, now leap." So just people were confused about that.
But just saying like, this is the moment, like it's time.
When in Rome, sort of thing.
Yeah, when in Rome is I mean, I think this is like one of the a really critical bit here, looking at I mean, the line there is, it's one of those things. It's like, as we were talking with Rosa, it's like sometimes devastating to read these things. When you're talking about proletarian movements, working class movements, it's like the ability to sort of the ability of those movements to sort of stop themselves in their tracks, and to allow the enemy to sort of recuperate and rebuild and come back with even more strength and harshness. I mean, you can look at the history of France for that. You can look at the history of the United States for that. Like, this is a very unfortunate mistake or reality of these moments that like Marx is seeing again in like in the 1850s.
No, that's funny you say that, because I always think about those guys in the 30s who were writing like free market capitalism. We put those guys and then we're just going to do technocratic, governmental focused capitalism, and that's going to be the history from here on out. It was like their own end of history moment in the 30s, and we see how long that lasted. And it's like a horror movie, like just kill the fucking guy. Don't like stab him and then run away. You got to make sure he's dead. I just watched A Dead Evil Rise, by the way. It's kind of mid. We'll continue here.
French development step by step, must have had a presentiment of the imminence of an unheard-of disgrace for the revolution. It was enough to hear the complacent yelps of victory with which the Democrats congratulated each other on the expectedly gracious consequences of the second Sunday in May 1852, day of elections. Louis Bonaparte's term was expired.
I mean, that reminds me a lot of like the Trump stuff, and even the, like to your point about the Trump, like how we're gonna end Trump, right? Like this is ultimately like, oh, we're delivered by this,
We're delivered by the system
ruling.
working, right?
Right. And it's like, well, if Trump was actually going to be emperor, like you're afraid of, this shit isn't going to be the sort of shit that would stop him.
Totally. And also, like, sorry, not to interrupt again,
Yep.
but like, again, like, if you have like a liberal view of like American politics or global politics, where it's just like Trump is just sort of like some aberration of like bad habits and manners of certain segments of the American population, instead of like a very, very real embodiment of fundamental rot in American capitalist society, the return to normalcy that like defeats him in the 2020 election doesn't defeat Trump, right?
Yeah.
If it's not Trump in in his flesh and blood, maybe it's a Trump nephew coming down the pipe, or a Trump
Barron,
son
baby.
coming next. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
the point here is that like the idea that like, Trump himself, like Trump is an embodiment of certain class forces and certain rot in the American system.
Yeah.
They're created purposefully by certain members, but they're also created by a lot of like by the Democratic Party, by the fact that we have like a political system that just sort of seems to ebb and flow between a Republican and a Democratic Party that like have really intense fights about certain issues, but fundamentally agree, for example, on like the exploitation of workers, on things like American empire and American power, right? All those things, like those don't get eradicated when Joe Biden comes into office. I mean, for fuck's sake, as we were talking about, I mean, Biden has put in Trump's border policies, asylum policies, and has effectively made them permanent, right? The difference there is the character and the way that he talks about them. So like it's not like those aspects of the American state and the American experience have been eradicated. And like this is, I think, as you were saying, Matt, like that is a really good analogy to the feeling that's like, oh yeah, his term's done. we've it's done, it's over now.
It's funny to see Marx in the moment mocking that sort of thing. And I'll just say, like, it's wild that people think Trump could be some sort of one-off, because Reagan is basically a similar sort of embodiment of the same forces, right? Like he's literally a fucking movie star acting with chimps, and then becomes like the pull yourself up by the bootstraps, America is limitless prosperity guy. Which is basically just what Trump is too, but you just more television as opposed to the movie era.
In their minds, that second Sunday of May had become a certain idea, a dogma, like the day of Christ's reappearance and the beginning of the millennium in the minds of the Chiliasts. As always, weakness had taken refuge in a belief in miracles, believed the enemy to be overcome when he was only conjured away in imagination, and lost all understanding of the present in an inactive glorification of the future that was in store for it, and the deeds it had in mind but did not want to carry out yet. Those heroes who seek to disprove their demonstrated incapacity by offering each other their sympathy and getting together in a crowd had tied up their bundles, collected their laurel wreaths in advance, and occupied themselves with discounting on the exchange market the Republic's in partibus, in name only, for which they had already providently organized the government personnel with all the calm of their unassuming disposition. December 2 struck them like a thunderbolt from a clear sky, and those who in periods of petty depression gladly let their inner fears be drowned by the loudest renters will perhaps have convinced themselves that the times are past when the cackle of geese could save the capital. Footnote there, the capital was a hill in Rome, a fortified citadel where the temples of Jupiter, Juno, and other gods were built. According to a legend, Rome was saved in 390 BCE from an invasion of the Gauls, due to the cackling of geese from Juno's temple, which awakened the sleeping guards of the capital.
So just some fun 19th century references there. But I do love like that December 2nd come like a thunderbolt from a clear blue sky. that does feel like what Trump winning in 2016 was like. Maybe that's a little bit too on the nose of a comparison, but that sort of like people believing in a certain bedtime story about how things go, and it doesn't actually go that way.
I mean, and like if you want to zoom in out even more, it's like what like I think like let's not over determine Trump. Like like I'm not saying to you, I'm just saying like, but we can look at like what these things sort of represent, right? And try to do some analysis of them. In a lot of ways, what is like the Trump moment? Why is like the liberal left and so much of the ruling class? Why did they become so discombobulated? Um, from like 2015 and his early, presidential campaign to his eventual victory. Well, they become very discombobulated because like what was the legend? What was the thing that was sort of keeping a lot of like the American elite like asleep in this country? It was like, is this end of history kind of understanding of the world, right? That like, the globe had sort of settled itself on an economic and government system. There was a sort of parameters of debate, and like politics had been sort of compacted into a very narrow sphere of society, right? And there will be fights and there will be spectacle and things like that, but like nothing that was going to open up the heavens like a thunderbolt. And like that, I think that like the analysis there of being able, I think that's a fine metaphor to make about the original like Trump victory. Was it was like one of those things where like people did not expect it, which is why everyone went absolutely wild and why they were clinging on to. People weren't even just clinging on to like earlier ideas of like the American Republic. People were clinging on to like recent memories of George W. Bush, right? As like the glory days of like the American society, right? Like not being able to see that like these things are in a direct lineage
Right.
to what was going to happen with Trump. But like you can see that like that's a very great real-time contemporary example of the lullabies that brought people to sleep, and then the stories that they were trying to tell each other to sort of motivate action. And again, the action is not fundamentally changing American society. It's not embracing a more progressive or socialist politics. It's, oh, we got to all show up and vote for, if Trump's the embodiment of like a certain class character of like the petty bourgeoisie and maybe some of the big industrial extractive capital, right? Joe Biden like wins in 2020, not because Joe Biden like is, forms this great coalition around like interests. Joe Biden is like the literal embodiment, like the physical embodiment of like the Democratic Party and the Democratic Party's, coalition. Like it's beyond Joe Biden, right? It's a lullaby. It's a story of like we're going to return to that. Like we're going to return to maybe some of the 90s triumphalism that Joe Biden maybe be able to bring us back to, right? And as you see, I mean, American society has, the past few years have been rough for working people. It's been rough to a lot of the projects that we might have thought were opening up as well, right? So these things they hit on multiple levels. Like one on like the actors, like the people who are genuinely believing in some of the stories, but also in people who might actually have the intention of changing them. I mean, like the situation we're in right now in 2023, I think in a lot of ways in terms of like mobilization and opening is a little bit worse off than we might have been in like a 2017, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
The Constitution, the National Assembly, the dynastic parties, the blue and red Republicans, the heroes of Africa, the thunder from the platform, the sheet lightning of the daily press, the entire literature, the political names and the intellectual reputations, the civil law and the penal code, liberté, égalité, fraternité, and the second Sunday in May 1852. All have vanished like a phantasmagoria before the spell of a man whom even his enemies do not make out to be a sorcerer.
It's a nephew.
Universal suffrage seems to have survived only for the moment, so that with its own hand it may make its last will and testament before the eyes of all the world, and declare in the name of the people itself, all that exists deserves to perish.
I mean, that section is like, I really... really hurts. Like universal suffrage kept around only to author its last will and testament. I feel like that's the way like the sort of Brexit vote referendum, like the Tory angled Brexit vote, like, and not that like there wasn't a argument against the European Union, but it was never going to be actioned by the way Cameron set that shit up. And it's just like then you get a whole new class of like particularly liberals who didn't want to leave Brexit being like, oh, we can't,
No, we
look at
can't do
what
vote. The vote
democracy,
doesn't count, right?
exactly, we can't do democracy, we have to get rid of democracy. It's like this is the worst sort of like chronology to see these things get laid out
Yeah.
in.
It is not enough to say, as the French do, that their nation was taken unawares. Nations and women are not forgiven the unguarded hour in which the first adventurer who came along could violate them. Such turns of speech do not solve the riddle, but only formulate it differently. It remains to be explained how a nation of 36 million can be surprised and delivered without resistance into captivity by 3 knights of industry. Let us recapitulate, in general outline, the phases that the French Revolution went through from February 24, 1848, to December 1851.
And we could just
Three
say
ma-
there, okay,
Yeah.
so we can move on. A little bit of a rough metaphor from old Carl there.
Yeah, I was gonna say like maybe leave out the woman tact metaphor. This is the 19th century. But yeah, come on, Carl. I'll also say like Carl was Jenny von Westphalen was selling jewelry to keep them keep them flush. So yeah, rough time for Carl. But yeah, and then there's 3 periods here. Just I'll state them, and then we'll let the narrator. But just so people can hear it, the February period, the period of constitutional, the period of the Constitution of the Republic or the Constituent National Assembly, that was May 1848 to May 28, 1849. In the period of the Constitutional Republic or the Legislative Assembly, May 28th, 1849 to December 2nd, 1851. And that is that December 2nd, which is the 18th Brumaire, where Louis Napoleon, Napoleon's nephew, said, oh, yeah, you know how I was president? Now I'm king again.
Periods are unmistakable. The February period, the period of the Constitution of the Republic or the Constituent National Assembly, May 1848 to May 28, 1849, and the period of the Constitutional Republic or the Legislative National Assembly, May 28, 1849 to December 2, 1851. The first period, from February 24, the overthrow of Louis Philippe, to May 4, 1848, the meeting of the Constituent Assembly, the February period proper, may be designated as the prologue of the Revolution. Its character was officially expressed in the fact that the government it improvised itself declared that it was provisional, and like the government, everything that was mentioned, attempted, or enunciated during this period proclaimed itself to be only provisional. Nobody and nothing ventured to lay any claim to the right of existence.
And again, this is just like he was talking about how like revolutions, they seem like halting, and this isn't a purely proletarian revolution, that's what he was talking about earlier, but this constant like second guessing of like how far you can go. And this is like a human, kings didn't worry about this because there's God, right?
Yeah.
Like, and Napoleon didn't worry about this because he fucking was winning wars.
He's
and
like
shit.
the embodiment of like, meritocracy or
Yeah.
excellence, right? Yeah, and like also like this is like a as good a point as ever to just remind folks too about like the class characters that like Marx is looking at like the French proletariat and predominantly like the Parisian proletariat,
Mhm.
right? And remember like um that like this is one thing too where this isn't maybe not be the place to do like a full recount and maybe analysis as like who is in the working class or who is not, but like some fundamental conditions is like being involved in wage labor, and that predominantly meant that we're talking about urban workers in in the major cities, factory workers, people doing that kind of labor. And remember that like the process of capitalism is in transferring large segments of the population in the proletariat, right? Because before that you have predominantly the vast majority of people are working in like agrarian agriculture, which has a very different relationship to property and society than like a landless, propertyless worker living in the city, right? Like it becomes a fundamental condition of like who you are as a human being, experiencing labor in that kind of setup. So, to remember that like the Parisian and like the proletariat in France, and like even like uniquely compared to the United Kingdom and Germany, if I understand correctly, Matt, France was able to maintain a much larger agrarian class than like some of those other like industrial nations, even at this point. So remembering too that like in France, you also have the reality that like there's this growing proletarian class, but there's a lot of other people who like you might consider as like not part of the elite necessarily, right? In the sense that like they're wealthy or they're capitalists or they're bosses.
Mhm.
But the idea that it was sort of defined and fully developed in France at that time, you know what I mean? Like
Right.
where you're going to sort of end up, where you and your kind of people, where you're from, and blah blah, like where they might be in 50 years, like that starts to really accelerate over this next period of French and European history.
Mhm.
But remembering too that like a lot of times the proletariat, as we'll get into here, like looking towards other alliances, while Marx sort of outlines how like that was a mistake. A lot of that is just because they're like, well, how can we form some semblance of a majority in French society at a time when that class is still like developing and it's growing, but it's not like at its highest form of like development.
Exactly.
Real action, all the elements that had prepared or determined the revolution: the dynastic opposition, the Republican bourgeoisie, the democratic Republican petty bourgeoisie, and the social democratic workers, provisionally found their place in the February government. It could not be otherwise. The February days originally intended an electoral reform by which the circle of the politically privileged among the possessing class itself was to be widened, and the exclusive domination of the aristocracy of finance overthrown. When it came to the actual conflict, however, when the people mounted the barricades, the National Guard maintained a passive attitude, the army offered no serious resistance, and the monarchy ran away, the Republic appeared to be a matter of course. Every party construed it in its own way. Having secured it arms in hand, the proletariat impressed its stamp upon it and proclaimed it to be a social republic. There was
So just to recap here, this is sort of a state of affairs that we could only dream about, which is right at this point. Hopefully, dream into existence. But like, there's a revolution, and like the whole power structure is like, all right, fuck it, we're screwed. You
Yeah.
guys, good luck. And now, how do we reconstitute ourselves? Well, we look to what we've been informed about, and it's that's a republic, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And
And
what does
also,
that?
just
Yeah.
like before it goes on too far, I just want to be explicit here. Just because, for example, that like the French proletariat is not like fully developed or whatever, doesn't mean that like successful revolution is foreclosed. I mean, a lot later, but like you look at like the Russian Revolution,
Mhm.
Russia was also like a highly agrarian society at that point, with the growing more militant and more organized working class during the Bolshevik Revolution. So I just want to be clear here.
Yeah.
It's not making that point is not like predetermining how things are going to go, because like the historical examples of like you don't have to wait for the potential proletariat to sort of become the largest and dominant class, but rather sort of understanding like, okay, this is what the reality was in like 1848, 1850s, when all this is happening, that it still is a developing class, so that you can sort of see where some of these decisions were made and maybe some of the logic or the reasons why folks felt they needed to go one way or the other, even if you're critical of them, understanding where they went.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like, yeah, like the Bolshevik Revolution, more of a sort of a self-conscious improvement
I mean,
on.
this is, I mean,
Yeah,
we'll have to do some more Lenin in the future, but this is the whole idea of like, Lenin's vanguard, right? Is that like, you only need like a significant, but like, it doesn't need to be the absolute majority, to sort of start pushing history in one direction or the other.
interesting.
indicated the general content of the modern revolution, a content which was in most singular contradiction to everything that, with the material available, with the degree of education attained by the masses, under the given circumstances and relations, could be immediately realized in practice. On the other hand, the claims of all the remaining elements that had collaborated in the February Revolution were recognized by the lion's share they obtained in the government. In no period, therefore, do we find a more confused mixture of high-flown phrases and actual uncertainty and clumsiness, of more...
This also reminds me when like Democrats will come out and say, yeah, we're doing reparations and like all this other stuff's like,
Yeah,
really like, okay. And then you actually look at their reparations thing. It's like, if you can convince sort of descendants of slaves that this is enough of, good luck with that.
Striving for innovation and more deeply rooted domination of the old routine, of more apparent harmony of the whole of society, and more profound estrangement of its elements. While the Paris proletariat still reveled in the vision of the wide prospects that had opened before it, and indulged in seriously meant discussions of social problems, the old powers of society had grouped themselves, assembled, reflected, and found unexpected support in the mass of the nation, the peasants and petty bourgeois, who all at once stormed onto the political stage after the barriers of the July monarchy had fallen. The second period, from May 4, 18...
I think it's clear there, but like these are the groups that like Marx really lays the charge that like those are the ones who drove what ends up happening forward is the peasants and the petty bourgeois.
1848 to the end of May 1849 is the period of the Constitution, the foundation of the bourgeois republic. Immediately after the February days, not only had the dynastic opposition been surprised by the Republicans, and the Republicans by the Socialists, but all France by Paris. The National Assembly, which met on May 4, 1848, had emerged from the national elections and represented the nation. It was a living protest against the pretensions of the February days, and was to reduce the results of the revolution to the bourgeois scale. In vain, the Paris proletariat, which immediately grasped the character of this National Assembly, attempted on May 15, a few days after it met, to negate its existence forcibly, to dissolve it, to disintegrate again into its constituent parts the organic form in which the proletariat was threatened by the reacting spirit of the nation. As is known, May 15 had no other result but that of removing Blanqui and his comrades, that is, the real leaders of the proletarian party, from the public stage for the entire duration of the cycle we are considering.
So yeah, I mean, we see here that original opening, you get the forces of reaction, different classes start to consider it as a threat, and through its own actions and that sort of conspiracy against it, the tide begins to turn.
Yeah, and just made really clear. And by the time they realized what was happening, and they tried to act on it, it was one of those things where it was almost a little too late.
And then here's the next section here.
The bourgeois monarchy of Louis Philippe can be followed only by a bourgeois republic. That is to say, whereas a limited section of the bourgeoisie ruled in the name of the king, the whole of the bourgeoisie will now rule in the name of the people. The demands of the Paris proletariat are utopian nonsense.
I mean, we should just say this again. This is why I find this text actually despite the historical complexity, a good intro to Marx, is because the guy can really write engagingly. It's very impressive because you don't get a lot. I mean, I don't want to overstate this. There's a lot of 19th century writers like Trollope. I mean, Dickens is fine, I guess, but as far as writing about real shit like this, Marx is just very entertaining.
I agree.
The whole of the bourgeoisie will now rule in the name of the people. The demands of the Paris proletariat are utopian nonsense, to which an end must be put. To this declaration of the Constituent National Assembly, the Paris proletariat replied with the June insurrection, the most colossal event in the history of European civil wars.
And yeah, this June insurrection here is really the moment where the proletariat sort of forms itself as in opposition to the reactionary classes, which themselves are unified to squash it. And you see a very similar thing happen in the English Civil War, where Cromwell and all those folks came together and said, we need to put these levelers and these ranters down. It's pretty marked pattern in these sort of things.
The bourgeois republic triumphed. On its side stood the aristocracy of finance, the industrial bourgeoisie, the middle class, the petty bourgeois, the army, the lumpen proletariat organized as the mobile guard, the intellectualites, the clergy, and the rural population. On the side of the Paris proletariat stood none but itself. More than 3,000 insurgents were butchered after the victory, and 15,000 were deported without trial. With this defeat, the proletariat passes into the background on the revolutionary stage. It attempts to press forward again on every occasion, as soon as the movement appears to make a fresh start, but with ever-decreased expenditure of strength and always slighter results. As soon as one of the social strata above it gets into revolutionary ferment, the proletariat enters into an alliance with it, and so shares all the defeats that the different parties suffer, one after another. But these subsequent blows become the weaker, the greater the surface of society over which they are distributed. The more important leaders of the proletariat in the assembly and in the press successively fall victim to the courts, and ever more equivocal figures come to head it. In part, it throws itself into doctrinaire experiments, exchange banks and workers' associations.
Just one biographical note on the leaders get in trouble with the courts. Marx himself was publishing the New Rhineland News, I believe, at the time. I believe it was in that capacity they came up with Workers of the World Unite, and had to flee Brussels because the authorities thought that an advance on his inheritance from his mother was going to be used to buy firearms. So this is very much a period of intense political repression. We shouldn't gloss over that. Like, Clemens von Metternich is sort of the J. Edgar Hoover of this time period, the post-Napoleon. We need to keep an eye on all these Republicans, have agents provocateurs, spies, to the point where, like, in the lead up to these revolutions, the only sort of, or the main avenue for free speech was at these banquets where people would eat, but you'd also like give these sort of toasts and stuff like that. But yeah, just a side note on that.
Well, one more note. I mean, I hope this doesn't clog up the text here, but there'll be more about this later. But this term lumpen proletariat, I think some people will be more or less familiar with. What is the lumpen proletariat, right? Lumpen is a German word, and what he means by the lumpen proletariat is the people who are like living in the urban areas, living in the cities, but they are not engaged in the wage labor system. He's talking about like the petty criminals and the illegal. I mean, he has I don't know if it's in this text or later, but he basically calls them scoundrels. It's like the people sort of like on the underbelly of French society. And the reason why Marx is very skeptical of this class, right, is because what is Marx's fundamental like understanding of politics and society in the world is that class interests begin to set the conditions for political activity. Well, unlike the proletariat, right, that actually has this universal like unity in the sense that it has to be constructed, the consciousness of it, but the sense that like there is a definitive class interest for the proletariat, right? Things that make their lives better, that are in conflict with society, that are with like the ruling class, that are in conflict with the way society is currently constituted. The petty criminals don't share that interest, and it's not even that they don't even share that interest with the proletariat. It's like they don't even share that interest with themselves, right? Because it is a class that is highlighted by its like individuality, which is why it can sort of be brought into, for example, like the reaction that we're seeing unfold there. So there'll be more on lumpen stuff later, but just so people know who he's talking about there with the lumpen proletariat, I think it's worthwhile because it is one of those archaic terms.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that gets thrown out by Marx haters as like, look at how elitist this guy is.
Yeah,
and it's just really silly.
Associations, hence into a movement in which it renounces the revolutionizing of the old world by means of the latter's own great combined resources.
Sorry, Matt. Sorry, I'm so sorry.
And seeks rather to achieve its salvation.
Just really briefly, like if you look at history, both of like socialist history, but even like some of like the more like national bourgeois revolutions, anti-colonial revolutions, like look at some of the roles of criminal classes during those periods, and like there are times when sometimes they're sitting there like funding certain groups, but more often than not, like their willingness and ability to sort of participate in like the highest aspects of reaction and in service of like the capitalist class and the bourgeoisie and the colonial classes. Like there's a lot of history there to sort of highlight the worriedness
Yeah.
that Marx has. Now, look, maybe Marx is like a moralist on this, and like maybe there's some criticisms you can make of him here, but like I um I think that like it's very that you can't just like wipe this criticism away if you look at the history of social struggles over the past 120 years about where this group has sort of lined itself up in these kind of ultimate moments
Yeah.
of struggle.
I mean, there are areas I wouldn't want to comment on where I know they have like sort of underworlds regard to gambling and stuff like. But America
Yeah,
particularly, I don't know the history of like too well, but I know certain partnerships between the American government and organized crime to deal with labor in like
yeah,
dockyards
exactly.
and stuff like that. And also Cuba had a similar situation going on there
Chile.
under
No, I mean
Batista.
that's the
Yeah.
exactly.
hence into a movement in which it renounces the revolutionizing of the old world by means of the latter's own great combined resources, and seeks rather to achieve its salvation behind society's back, in private fashion, within its limited conditions of existence.
This is where I put a "Hello Rosa" comment on my in my margin.
Equivocal figures come to head it. In part, it throws itself into doctrinaire experiments, exchange banks, and workers' associations, hence into a movement in which it renounces the revolutionizing of the old world by means of the latter's own great combined resources, and seeks rather to achieve its salvation behind society's back, in private fashion, within its limited conditions of existence, and hence necessarily suffers shipwreck. It seems to be unable either to rediscover revolutionary greatness in itself or to win new energy from the connections newly entered into, until all classes with which it contended in June themselves lie prostrate beside it. But at least it succumbs with the honors of the great world historic struggle. Not only France, but all Europe trembles at the June earthquake, while the ensuing defeats of the upper classes are so cheaply bought that they require barefaced exaggeration by the victorious party to be able.
That's funny. Like everyone remembers like how the proletariat was beat, but the other classes just folded, and nobody really,
Yeah.
not even worth doing a highlight reel of.
Able to pass for events at all, and become the more ignominious the further the defeated party is removed from the proletarian party. The defeat of the June insurgents, to be sure, had now prepared, had leveled the ground on which the bourgeois republic could be founded and built, but it had shown at the same time that in Europe the questions at issue are other than that of republic or monarchy. It had revealed that here bourgeois republic signifies the unlimited despotism of one class over other classes. It had proved that in countries with an old civilization, with a developed formation of classes, with modern conditions of production, and with an intellectual consciousness in which all traditional ideas have been dissolved by the work of centuries, the republic signifies, in general, only the political form of revolution of bourgeois society, and not its conservative form of life, as, for example, in the United States of North America, where, though classes already exist, they have not yet become fixed, but continually change and interchange their elements in constant flux, where the modern means of production, instead of coinciding with a stagnant surplus population, rather compensate for the relative deficiency of heads and hands, and where, finally, the feverish, youthful movement of material production, which has to make a new world of its own, has neither time nor opportunity left for abolishing the old world of ghosts.
Yeah, that's an interesting little section on America there. It'd be interesting to hear him develop it more. Just that,
I
like,
think
yeah,
this would be more of a project for us to do in like the written word maybe than this, but um, Marx and Engels like analysis of the U.S. is always really interesting to me because they they see a lot of potential in it. They obviously, are worried about the reaction of slavery. Marx's famous line, like, labor can't be free when in the white skin it's branded. Sorry, in the black skin it's branded. But no, I mean, like, what he's, I mean, if I'm correct here, like, what he's getting at here is that, in the US, because, like, there's just such a need of people and labor, that, like, the solidity of, like, class society there is a little bit more in flux than it might be in a developed country like France. And you can
Right.
see that how it reflects itself in its politics. And, like, an interesting point could be drawn out of that is, like, the one question is, like, why was it so difficult for there to be a labor party in the United States in the same way that there was, or socialist party, or whatever you want to call it, party of the working class, of the working class's interest, in the U.S. When instead in the U.S., like, not only do we have, like, class parties in the sense that they reflect, like, uh, the interests of the ruling class, but, like incredibly regional. Like, one thing that's really amazing about American politics, even today, but particularly at that time, was just how regional politics were. That, you just had
Right.
entire regions of the country going one way, and entire regions of the country going the other, and, like, the political parties, like, really just became like spoil systems for the ruling elites in certain parts of the nation. Obviously, with shifts and ruptures like the Civil War and things like that. But yeah, no, I mean, it's like, it's an interesting, I mean, and, like, Marx talks about, the United States, and, like, how world historic it was that they found, gold in California in the, in the Communist Manifesto. Like, that's, like, the beginning of the Communist Manifesto. That, like,
Yeah.
there is an aspect to America about, like, the incredible amount of land it was, and, like, the limited amount of population that, like, actually lived, in the country relative to its, like, landmass, that, like, definitely creates, like, unique political conditions, certainly in the 19th century.
Oh yeah, that it still had the juice in the imagination of Europe in a way that I don't think, or that changed, I think, after probably World War One, or at least World War Two, where America becomes like more of the world power, but as opposed to like the constantly on the rise experiment of like Europe, basically.
Yeah. And like, my, like, I could do a whole fanfic on, like, if Marx actually was successful moving to San Antonio, Texas, when he was trying to, would have been a very fascinating, like, historical blip. Who knows what would have happened from that? But no, I mean, I do think that it's worthwhile. And, like, anyways, like, you see this a lot in, like, in Marx and Engels, when they're writing about the U.S., is that, like, there are, they're not, and also, like, I think too that, like, sometimes as Americans we might misremember how powerful the United States became, in the World War I, World War II period.
Right.
Too, like, there were a lot of like, America still wasn't considered to be, like, the elite preeminent power at that time, certainly not by 1848,
Yeah.
but there was a
Well,
sense that, like, something was happening there that was going to be big.
yeah, and it definitely didn't have like a history, like he says, in the sense that Europe did. Like it had Washington,
Yeah,
and that was
whereas,
pretty
like,
much it.
what, like, in 1850s, we're talking the American Revolution is 74 years ago. It'd be like talking
Yeah,
about something that happened in the 1950s, right? It's not that far away.
Eisenhower. Yeah, exactly. The only history you have is Eisenhower.
Yeah.
During the June days, all classes and parties had united in the party of order against the proletarian class as the party of anarchy, of socialism, of communism. They had, quote, saved society from, quote, the enemies of society. They had given out the watchwords of the old society, property, family, religion, order, to their army as passwords, and had proclaimed to the counter-revolutionary crusaders, in this sign thou shalt conquer. From that moment, as soon as one of the numerous parties which gathered under this sign against the June insurgents seeks to hold the revolutionary battlefield in its own class interest, it goes down before the cry, property, family, religion, order. Society is saved just as often as the circle of its rulers contracts, as a more exclusive interest is maintained against a wider one. Every demand of the simplest bourgeois financial reform, of the most ordinary liberalism, of the most formal republicanism, of the most shallow democracy, is simultaneously castigated as a, quote, attempt on society and stigmatized as socialism. Boy, this sounds familiar. And finally, the high priests of religion and order themselves are driven with kicks from their Pythian tripods, hauled out of their beds in the darkness of night, put in prison vans, torn into dungeons or sent into exile. Their temple is razed to the ground. Their mouths are sealed, their pens broken, their law torn to pieces in the name of religion, of property, of the family, of order. Bourgeois fanatics for order are shot down on their balconies by mobs of drunken sailors, their domestic sanctuaries profaned, their houses bombarded for amusement, in the name of property, of the family, of religion, and of order. Finally, the scum of bourgeois society forms the holy phalanx of order, and the hero Krapulinski, a character from Heine's poem The Two Knights, dissolute aristocrat, installs himself in the Tuileries as the, quote, savior of society.
Yeah.
There
Well,
it is.
that's chapter 1 of the 18th Brumaire. I mean, before we talk about programming, I mean, there's a lot in there to look at. I mean, I think that, you know, a lot of the reasons that like we might have been talking about contemporary examples were not so much to say that like these are exact like line for lines like recreations of what happened with Trump, for example, is like a line for line recreation of the empire under Louis Bonaparte.
Right.
Dylan Riley of New Left Review does have an interesting piece that he wrote in 2017 about that, if people want to read that. But rather, like, the reason that this is like interesting is, as you were saying when we brought it up, is like not only because it's like an interesting analysis of like a direct challenge to some of people were using this as like a counter argument to like what Marx was saying effectively, right? Like, look, this is what happens. This is why like proletarian revolution may not be possible. So like it's interesting from that historical level, but it's also interesting to see like how is Marx sort of looking at events unfolding around him at that time to get a better understanding of like a Marxist view of politics in your own time, to sort of see how he's analyzing these things, because like it's not deterministic. I don't think that you can look at that text, that first chapter, and say that like Marx is solely an economic determinist, because some of the criticisms he's making there are things that like could have been different.
Yeah.
And like recognizing that contingency, which is like a word that becomes very popular later in a lot of Marxist theory, right? The possibility, right? So it's like everything is not solely determined by the economy, but production and material reality like does sort of limit what opportunities are available. But there's a lot of historical contingency that's possible. There's a lot of different ways that things are going, and like a way to think about that is like particularly when you have movements that are embodied in personality or in an individual, like the contingency starts to get way bigger, right? Because it's like if one person or a small group of people is able to influence society in the level that ends up happening after the coup in France, these things do really start to reflect particular natures of people, right? And anyways, like this is like adding that complexity that I think is useful, so that people aren't being a dogmatist. But it's also not a rejection of like class analysis and historical materialism by any stretch of the imagination. It's probably one of the better run-throughs of at least coming from Marx himself, of looking at the world as it's unfolding around you with that Marxist lens.
Yeah, I mean, exactly, because I think like the Louis Napoleon Trump, just to go on that one more time, is this sort of confusion of like, how could people vote for this?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that's not really like, if that's not the interesting bit of analysis, is like what people do in the voting booths. It's like what sort of classes led that to be the sort of option,
Yeah.
right? And versus the other option, which is like, Hillary at that point.
Exactly.
And like what, and again, like it's not like I have plenty of time for getting into Hillary as a person. Like I don't like her, but like what does she represent?
Yeah.
It's a choice that like the New Democrats made in the 80s, right?
Mhm.
They wanted a candidate like her, and they got her because they wanted
Yeah.
to go for a more sort of professional class type of voter.
Yeah, exactly. Well, again, I highly suggest people take some time to, to read this text. We'll be doing these like we did with the Rosa series in a few different episodes. We're still figuring out our structure. The next few chapters really go through particular periods of history. The chapters aren't as long as this opening chapter, but we might sort of do like an omnibus, compact a few of them into one.
Yeah.
We'll figure that out as we go. But as always, folks, appreciate doing these so much, and let us know what you think, and let people know about these so that they can join in the conversation too. And appreciate all of our patrons and supporters of Left Reckoning.